In this video, we're going to focus on how to animate pie charts. Now, just so you can see how I built this pie chart, let's go ahead and double click on the 01 pie chart shape comp in the project panel. Then in the timeline, select layer 1 and press Command E on the Mac or Control E on Windows to edit the original file. Make sure you're in the Essentials layout and go down to your Layers panel and make sure it's active, and then click the selection target on the right side of the pie chart layer. Now we can hover over the pie chart layer and just right click or control click and go to the data section. In here, this is where I entered the data that I wanted to add to create my pie chart. Once you added enough pieces of the pie, you can literally just go over here and click the apply checkbox and it'll generate the pie shape. Now, if I expand my pie chart layer here, notice it's just a grouped layer. Now, I could expand this even further by ungrouping this graph layer and then extracting each individual piece onto its own layer, but I've already done that for you in a different comp. And if you haven't seen that process, please just jump back to earlier points in the title because I've definitely covered it multiple times. All right. I'm going to go ahead and just close this Illustrator file and jump back here into After Effects. So we'll start with the 01 pie chart shape composition. Make sure layer 1 is selected, then go up under Layer and choose Create Shapes from Vector Layer. Now with my new shape layer, I can open up its options and open up its contents, and you can see I have a group for each individual piece of the pie. Now I want to scale all these pieces of the pie so that they appear individually. So I'll click on the word contents and go over here to this add button. Let's click on that and choose offset paths. Notice it makes each piece slightly larger. If I open the offset paths options here in the timeline, I can scrub on the amount to make the pieces larger or smaller. So let's drag to the left and set our first keyframe at about -130. Make sure your current time indicator is at frame 0 and add a keyframe to the amount. Let's move down to about 1 second in the timeline and change this amount to a value of about -5. Then when I press return here, notice I have a nice space between each of the different shapes. If I just click anywhere in this gray area to deselect, now when I scrub, you can see each of the pieces are scaling up from nothing to this nice setup pie with a little bit of gap in between each of the pieces. Now, of course, you could select the keyframes and add an ease on the keyframes and create interesting animation, but I want to go ahead and keep polishing this animation. So I'll just click anywhere here in this dark gray area to deselect all of my pie pieces. I'll close the contents and I'll open my transform options. Here I have rotation parameters. So I'm going to move back to frame 0 and I'll add a keyframe for rotation. Then I'll move down the timeline, and let's move down to about 110, just so it's a little past my other keyframes. And let's add 2 full rotations. So I'll click on this first parameter and say 2. So now if I scrub, it's not only going to have each piece come up, but it's going to add a rotation. The only problem is this. Notice how wobbly that rotation is. Well, I can quickly and easily fix this without having to make any adjustments to my keyframes. So let's move our current time indicator so it's on the second keyframe here at 110. Then I'll change the magnification up to 200% so I can more clearly see the center of my project. Now I need to go grab my pan behind tool and click on my center point and position it right over this little intersection here of my 3 shapes. And it may take a second to reposition this properly, and you can definitely change the magnification up a little higher if you want to have a little more high definition as you reposition. So I think that's close enough for now. I'll grab my selection tool and just zoom out using the comma key. And now if I scrub, you can see I have it spinning in, and each of the different pieces are scaling up like so. Now, of course, all the keyframes are linear, so I highly recommend selecting the keyframes and polishing your animation in the keyframe editor or the graph editor. So let's go to the 02 comp. In here, I want to animate the appearance of each one of these elements, but I want them to appear in sequence. And rather than having to create keyframes and slide keyframes, I want to sequence these layers. So let's click on layer 1 and hold down Shift and click on layer 3. Let's move our current time indicator to about frame 20. And let's press Option S on the Mac or Shift Alt S on Windows to open the scale parameter and add a scale keyframe. We can move back to frame 0 and change the scale setting on any one of these selected layers to 0, and that'll go ahead and add keyframes for each piece of the pie. So if we scrub, you can see it's scaling up beautifully. Now I want them to scale one after the other, and since I selected layer 1 first and then clicked through layer 3, this will sequence in the order in which we selected the layers. Let's move our current time indicator to our second keyframe here. I'll do that by using my navigation arrows in the timeline. Now I'll press Option right bracket or Alt right bracket on the PC to trim all the selected layers. Now I can go up under Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and sequence these layers. Make sure there's no overlap and click OK, and notice now they sequence from the top down. Now the layers disappear after it sequences, so let's move all the way down to the end of our timeline and press Option right bracket again or Alt right bracket to extend the end of our layers. So now if I press the spacebar in preview, you can see each individual element is popping into the scene. So if we want to add our rotation now, if we tried to rotate on each layer, each piece would spin around its own center point. So what I'm going to do is go up under Layer and add a new null object. This null is added to the center of the project. Hold down Shift and click on Layer 4, and go to the parent column, click on the pick whip, and point it at my null. If you didn't have the parent column, you could just right-click or control-click next to the layer name and just make sure parent is selected. Now, since I used the pick whip and pointed it at null 1, if I select null 1 and press R for its rotation, I can now animate the rotation of all of these elements by just rotating around the null. But I know you guys know how to add keyframes, so I'm just going to stop right here. Whether you go through the process of extracting each individual layer or just start with the pie chart itself, there are many different ways you can create animations for pie charts inside of After Effects.